The music of the string quartet felt like a shroud settling over Eleanor Vane's. It was beautiful, of course, a delicate and intricate thing meant to inspire delight. But to her, it was merely the sound of her own gilded cage. She stood near a bank of ferns, the fronds brushing against the pale silk of her gown, a dress chosen by her aunt to make her appear youthful. It did not work. At 26, with no dowry, and a face she knew to be more pleasant than beautiful, she was firmly, irrevocably on the shelf. The realization no longer brought a sting of tears, but a dull, quiet ache in her bones, a weariness that had become her most constant companion. Her fingers, hidden in the folds of her skirt, traced the cool, familiar outline of the locket she wore beneath her bodice. It was her only true treasure, a miniature of her mother, painted by her own hand in secret years ago. It was a skill her father had despised, a frivolous waste of time for a young lady who ought to have been practicing her French or her needlepoint. But for Annalise, it was breathing. She saw the world in tiny, perfect compositions, in the way candlelight caught the edge of a jaw or deepened the shadows beneath a proud man's eyes. She watched the dancers swirl across the polished floor, a kaleidoscope of jewels and satin. Her aunt, Lady Beatrice, was fluttering nervously by the refreshment table, her fan working like the wing of a trapped bird. Every so often, her aunt's gaze would find Annalise, and her expression would pinch with a familiar mix of pity and exasperation. Annalise had long ago stopped trying to live up to the frantic hopes in her aunt's eyes. She was a project that had failed. A portly baron, his face florid with wine, had attempted to engage her in conversation earlier. He had spoken of his hounds, his gout, and the deplorable state of the roads, all while his eyes roamed over her with the speculative air of a man pricing livestock. She had answered his questions with polite monosyllables until he had huffed and moved on, leaving her in the blessed quiet of her own invisibility. This was her place at such gatherings, a silent observer, a piece of furniture that happened to breathe. Then the room shifted. It was a subtle thing, a collective intake of breath, a straightening of spines. Annalise felt the change in atmospheric pressure before she saw its cause. The Duke of Blackwood had arrived. He stood in the grand archway, a figure of stark, severe elegance. He was not handsome in the classical sense. His features were too sharp, his mouth too thin. But he possessed a power that was more magnetic than mere beauty. It was in the absolute stillness of his posture, the unnerving intelligence in his dark eyes, and the single, immaculate black glove he wore on his left hand, a peculiar affectation that sparked endless gossip. Annalise watched him as he moved through the room, a shark gliding through a school of guppies. Titled hosts bowed and scraped. Ambitious mothers pushed their blushing daughters into his path. He acknowledged them all with the same cool, dismissive nod. He was a man entirely self-possessed, radiating an aura of untouchable solitude. He was, Annalise thought with the dispassionate eye of an artist, a fascinating subject. The light carved his face into harsh planes of shadow and brilliance, and she felt the familiar itch in her fingers to capture it, to distill that cold arrogance into a space no larger than her thumb. It was Lord Pemberley who sealed her fate. He was a young, foppish man, desperate to climb the social ladder, and he saw an opportunity to ingratiate himself with the Duke. Spotting Annalise in her alcove, he steered the formidable Duke in her direction. Annalise's heart gave a single hard thud against her ribs. She wanted to melt into the damask wallpaper behind her. "Your Grace," Lord Pemberley said, his voice slick with sycophancy. May I present Lady Annalise Vance, a true English rose, though perhaps a touch reserved. The Duke's gaze fell upon her. It was not a glance, but an assessment, swift and thorough and utterly impersonal. He took in her simple gown, her unadorned hair, the quiet way she held herself. Annalise met his eyes directly, a flicker of defiance she could not suppress. For a moment, she saw something in his expression, not interest, but a flash of what? Weariness? Annoyance? He did not speak to her. He addressed Lord Pemberley, but his voice was loud enough for everyone in their vicinity to hear. It was a voice accustomed to command, deep and resonant and utterly devoid of warmth. "Pemberley," the Duke said, his tone laced with a faint, cruel amusement. "I have no time for faded goods. Surely you can find a more promising investment for my attention." The words hung in the suddenly silent air. The Duke's dismissal was sharp and cold, like the scent of iron on a winter morning. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. Lord Pemberley's face went from pale to crimson. Annalise felt 100 pairs of eyes fix upon her, waiting for the tears, the horrified retreat. But the tears did not come. A strange, glacial calm washed over her. She had been called worthless before, in subtler, more insidious ways, every day of her life for the past decade. This was merely a louder, more public declaration of a truth she had already accepted. The insult was a stone thrown at a fortress that had been built, brick by painful brick, long ago. It could not touch the woman inside. She did not flinch. She did not argue. She simply held the Duke of Blackwood's gaze for one heartbeat longer. Then she smiled. It was not a large smile, just a small, enigmatic curve of her lips. It was a smile that acknowledged his cruelty without accepting it, a shield of glass, appearing fragile but turning back the heat of the world. She gave a flawless, graceful curtsy, turned her back on him and the stunned silence of the room, and walked away. The next morning, the light that streamed into Annalise's small bedroom felt different. It felt cleaner, sharper. Her aunt had been in a state of high hysterics since their return, decrying the Duke's boorishness and Annalise's ruin. Annalise had listened quietly, offering soothing platitudes while a plan, bold and terrifying, formed in her mind. She had not slept. Instead, she had sat at her small writing desk, the tools of her secret trade laid out before her. She had worked by the light of a single candle, her finest brush in hand, a sliver of prepared vellum before her. She had not needed a sketch. The Duke's face was burned into her memory, the arrogant tilt of his head, the contempt in his eyes, and beneath it all, the flicker of something else, something haunted and desperately hidden that only an artist's eye would perceive. She had painted him in the exact moment of his insult, capturing not just a likeness, but an essence. By dawn, it was finished. A portrait no bigger than a crown piece, yet it held the power of a grand canvas. It was him. It was the truth of him. She placed it in a small velvet-lined box. On a sheet of crisp paper, she wrote a simple, unsigned note. "A likeness for your collection, so you do not forget the man you are." She sealed the package and sent it by messenger to the Duke of Blackwood's London residence. Then, and only then, did she feel the tremor in her hands. She had thrown a stone back at the most powerful man in England. The hours that followed were suspended in a strange, taut silence. Her aunt left to pay calls, still lamenting Annalise's fate. Annalise sat by the window, her sewing untouched in her lap, and waited. She did not know what she expected. A furious reply? A visit from his solicitor threatening her with legal action? Or, most likely, nothing at all. Her tiny act of defiance would be crushed by the sheer weight of his indifference. Just after 2 o'clock, a carriage pulled up outside their modest townhouse. It was not ostentatious, but its glossy black panels and the perfectly matched pair of greys bespoke immense wealth. The ducal crest was emblazoned on the door. Annalise's breath caught in her throat. The footman sprang down and lowered the steps. The Duke of Blackwood emerged. He did not look angry. He looked grim, resolute. He strode to the door, and the sound of the heavy brass knocker echoed through the small house. The parlour-maid, her eyes wide with shock, showed him into the drawing-room where Annalise was waiting. She had risen to her feet, her hands clasped before her. He did not bother with pleasantries. He stopped in the center of the room, his gaze locking with hers. The ever-present glove on his left hand seemed starker, blacker in the afternoon light. He held the small box she had sent him. "This," he said, his voice a low rumble, "is the most honest thing anyone has ever given me." He did not open the box. He did not need to. "You have an extraordinary eye, Lady Annalise." Annalise inclined her head, her heart hammering against her ribs. "You have an unforgettable face, Your Grace." A flicker of something, surprise, respect, crossed his features. You took a step closer. "I am not here to apologize. An apology would be an insult, a paltry attempt to plaster over a truth I spoke. I am a cold and ruthless man. The portrait does not lie." "No," she agreed softly. "It does not." "I am here," he continued, his voice dropping even lower, "to make a proposition, a transaction, if you will." He paused, and the silence in the room was as heavy and close as velvet in a sealed room. "I require a wife. The entail on my primary estate demands I am wed with an heir, or it passes to a cousin I despise. I have avoided this necessity for years, but my solicitors inform me my time has run out." Annalise stared at him, bewildered. This was not what she had expected. "I require a duchess who will be quiet," he said, the word chosen with deliberate care. "A woman who will not make social demands, who will not fill my house with her simpering friends, who will not expect affection or conversation. A woman who will perform her duties and otherwise leave me to my own affairs. In return, you will receive a title, a home, and financial security beyond anything you could imagine. You will be the Duchess of Blackwood. You will want for nothing material ever again." He was offering her a prison of gold instead of her current one of bronze. He was offering to buy her, to install her in his life like a piece of fine, silent furniture. It was another insult, grander and more terrible than the one at the ball. And yet, she thought of her aunt's constant, wearying anxiety. She thought of the succession of grasping, unpleasant suitors she would be forced to endure. She thought of a future spent as a dependent, a burden, growing older and more invisible with each passing year. The Duke's offer was cold, yes. It was a business arrangement. But it was also, in its own stark way, an escape. It was freedom. Freedom from expectation. Freedom from pity. Freedom to be left alone. And in that solitude, she could paint. With the resources of a duchess, she could have a studio. She could have the finest brushes, the rarest pigments from every corner of the empire. She could create without hiding, without shame. He was offering her the world, not in the form of his love, but in the form of his absence. "I see," she said, her voice betraying none of the turmoil inside her. "A duchess in name only." "Precisely," he confirmed. "A partner in a contract." She looked at him, the powerful, lonely man who saw people as assets and liabilities. She saw the fortress he had built around himself, a fortress that made her own look like a garden wall. And in that moment, she made her choice. "I accept your terms, Your Grace," Annalise said. The wedding was a swift, sterile affair, conducted by special license in the Duke's London library. Only her aunt and his solicitor, a dry man named Mr. Thompson, were in attendance. Lady Beatrice wept throughout, whether from joy at Annalise's spectacular match or sorrow at the glacial coldness of the ceremony, Annalise could not tell. Alistair, her new husband, stood beside her, as remote and unreadable as a marble statue. He had slipped a heavy gold band onto her finger, his gloved hand brushing hers for a brief, cold second. And then it was done. She was the Duchess of Blackwood. The journey to Blackwood Manor, the ducal seat in the heart of the countryside, was made in near total silence. Annalise sat opposite him in the perfectly sprung carriage, watching the green hills of England roll by. He did not speak, his gaze fixed on the landscape, his jaw set. She did not try to bridge the chasm between them. This was the arrangement she had accepted. Blackwood Manor was not a house. It was a testament to power. A vast, Gothic edifice of grey stone that seemed to rise from the earth itself, it dominated the surrounding valley. It was magnificent and profoundly intimidating. Inside, an army of servants lined the great hall. A severe, grey-haired housekeeper stepped forward. "Your Grace," she said, bowing to Alistair. "Welcome home." "Mrs. Davis," he said, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "This is the Duchess. You will see to her needs. Her rooms are to be the suite in the east wing. My own are in the west. You will ensure she is not disturbed and that her privacy is paramount." And with that, he turned and ascended the grand staircase, disappearing without a backward glance. The contract had begun. Annalise was left standing in the great hall, the new mistress of a house whose master was a stranger, the ruler of a kingdom in which she was merely a ghost. The days that followed fell into a strange, formal rhythm. They dined together each evening in a dining hall that could have seated 100. The vast expanse of polished mahogany between them was a tangible representation of the distance in their marriage. They spoke of the weather, of estate matters in the most general terms, of news from the papers. Their conversation was a polite, brittle veneer over a profound emptiness. He would retire to his library immediately after the meal, and she would be left to wander the silent, echoing corridors of her new home alone. Her suite in the east wing was opulent, with a canopied bed and silks from the Orient, but it felt like a luxurious cell. She found the place she was looking for on the third day, a large, disused solarium at the very back of the house. It was filled with dusty, shrouded furniture and forgotten potted plants, long since dead. But its glass walls faced north and east, and it was flooded with a perfect, gentle light. It was a studio. She began to spend her days there, at first tentatively, with the small travel set of paints she had brought with her. She painted the dead leaves of a geranium, the intricate patterns of dust on a pane of glass. The act of creation was a balm to her soul, a silent rebellion against the emptiness of her life. She lost hours in the quiet concentration of her work, the world outside the dusty glass walls ceasing to exist. One afternoon, she was so absorbed in mixing a particular shade of green that she did not hear him enter. She looked up with a start to see him standing in the doorway, his tall frame silhouetted against the light of the corridor. Her first instinct was fear, the old shame her father had instilled in her. She made a move to cover her work. "Do not," he said. His voice was not harsh, merely firm. He walked into the room, his boots silent on the stone floor. He did not look at her, but at the clutter of her paints and the small, intense studies she had pinned to an old trellis. He stopped before a rendering of a single, fallen feather. So detailed she had captured the tiny, individual barbs. He studied it for a long time. Annalise held her breath. He said nothing. He simply turned and left. The next morning, when Annalise entered the solarium, it was transformed. The dusty furniture was gone. The dead plants had been cleared away. The glass had been washed until it sparkled. In the center of the room stood a brand new, professional artist's easel. Against one wall was a beautiful cabinet, its drawers filled with every imaginable supply: brushes of sable and hogshair, vellum and ivory, and a breathtaking array of pigments in small glass jars. There were colors she had only ever read about: lapis lazuli, Tyrian purple, cochineal. There was no note. There was no explanation. When she saw him at dinner that evening, he made no mention of it. They spoke of a tenant farmer's request for a new roof. But as he looked at her, she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a grudging acknowledgement. He had not given her praise, but he had given her a space to exist. He had given her tools. It was more than anyone else ever had. Her art became her life. The solarium was her sanctuary. She began to work on larger pieces of ivory, her confidence growing with each stroke. She painted the landscapes she could see from the window, the servants as they went about their duties, the intricate architecture of the old house. She kept her best work locked in a leather portfolio, still a secret, still hers alone. Her newfound purpose was tested by the arrival of Lady Ashworth, a neighbouring landowner and the county's preeminent gossip. She arrived for tea one afternoon, her eyes sharp and her questions sharper. She surveyed Annalise's plain day dress with a critical air. "My dear Duchess," she began, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "you are looking a little pale. Country life can be so dull, can it not? With the Duke so often occupied. You must find a hobby to fill the endless hours. Charity work, perhaps? Or have you any prospect of, well, of providing an heir?" The question was a dart, aimed with precision. Annalise felt the familiar heat of shame rise in her cheeks. Before she could formulate a reply, she heard the click of the drawing-room door. Alistair stood there. He had clearly overheard. She saw a muscle tighten in his jaw, a protective instinct she had never witnessed before. But before he could speak, Annalise found her own voice. A strange calm settled over her, the same calm she had felt at the ball. She was the Duchess of Blackwood now. She would not be patronized in her own home. She smiled serenely at Lady Ashworth. "Thank you for your concern, my lady," she said, her tone perfectly even. "But I assure you, my hours are quite full. His Grace has entrusted me with the oversight of the household ledgers. I find accounting to be a most fascinating and fulfilling pursuit. It requires a great deal of precision." Lady Ashworth blinked, nonplussed. Accounting was hardly the genteel pastime she had expected. Alistair, who had indeed given her the ledgers after discovering her sharp mind for numbers, remained silent in the doorway, but Annalise could feel his stillness. It was not a cold stillness now, but an attentive one. She had not only defended herself, she had defended their arrangement, their private, businesslike partnership. She had protected his trust in her. When Lady Ashworth finally departed, flustered and empty-handed of any real gossip, Alistair walked over to the tea service. "She is a venomous old woman," he said, his back to her. "She is a bored one," Annalise replied quietly. "There is a difference." He turned, and for the first time, he looked at her not as a contract or a convenience, but as a person. "You handled her with efficiency." "As you said, Your Grace," Annalise replied, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "It is a transaction. I am merely protecting my investment." The remark was meant to be arch, to restore the familiar distance between them, but it did not. Instead, it seemed to create a new, tentative bridge, a shared understanding. After that day, the silence at their dinners was a little less heavy, the space between them a little less vast. The summer deepened, turning the hills around Blackwood Manor a lush, heavy green. Annalise's portfolio grew thick with her work. She painted portraits of the staff, capturing the weariness in the head groom's eyes and the shy smile of a young kitchen maid. Her skill had become a formidable thing, sharp and true, but she had never again attempted to paint her husband. The memory of that first, defiant portrait stood between them, an unspoken truth. One evening in late August, a storm rolled in, breaking the oppressive heat. Rain lashed against the windows of the manor. Annalise was in her studio, the scent of oil and turpentine mingling with the smell of wet earth. She was working on a new piece, a self-portrait, trying to capture the woman she was becoming, not the girl she had been. The door opened, and Alistair entered. This was unusual. He never sought her out, especially not in her sanctuary. He was not dressed for dinner. He wore riding breeches and a linen shirt, open at the collar. His hair was damp from the rain. He looked strained, his face pale beneath its tan. He walked to the center of the room and stopped, his gaze fixed on her. The air between them crackled with a tension that had nothing to do with the storm outside. "I was in my father's old study," he said, his voice rough. "Going through his papers." He paused. "I found a letter from my mother. In it was a miniature of my brother." Annalise put her brush down, her hand suddenly unsteady. She knew of his younger brother, Thomas, who had died as a boy. His portrait, a somber oil painting of a serious-faced child, hung in the long gallery. "The portrait you sent me in London," Alistair said, his voice barely a whisper. "After the ball. I have looked at it every night since. I keep it by my bed." He finally met her eyes, and she saw a raw, agonizing vulnerability there that stunned her. "How did you see it?" he asked. "How did you see the rot in me from a single glance across a ballroom?" "I didn't see rot," Annalise said softly. "I saw a haunting. I saw a man wearing a mask." He let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "A mask. Yes." He took a deep, shuddering breath. "My father was a monster. Not a firm man, not a disciplinarian. A monster. He believed the Blackwood name was forged in iron and pain, and he was determined to beat that strength into his sons." He began to pace the room, the story pouring out of him, as if a dam had finally broken. "Thomas was gentle. He loved books, music. My father despised it. He saw it as weakness. One day, I was 12, Thomas was 9. My father found him trying to write a poem instead of practicing his Latin. He took a poker from the fireplace. Alistair stopped, his back to her. His shoulders were rigid. I stepped in front of him. I took the blow meant for Thomas. He slowly, deliberately, began to unbutton the cuff of his shirt. Then he began to peel off the black glove. Annalise watched, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. He turned and held out his left hand. It was not a hand. It was a ruin. A mass of gnarled, twisted scar tissue, the bones of the fingers fused at unnatural angles. It was a testament to a moment of horrific, savage violence. Annalise felt a wave of nausea, of profound pity and horror. "It healed badly," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. But that was not the worst of it. The worst was that it did not matter. A year later, Thomas caught a fever of the lungs. He was gone in a week. I had taken the blow. I had borne the pain, but I had not saved him. My great act of defiance was meaningless. It changed nothing. He looked at his ruined hand, then back at her, his face a mask of anguish. "That is the man I am, Annalise. The man you painted. A failure. A man who carries his own monstrosity on his sleeve, or rather, under his glove. The cruelty I show the world, it is what I feel for myself. What I said to you at the ball, it was born of that self-loathing. I saw your quietness and mistook it for the same weakness my father despised in my brother. And I hated you for it, because I could not bear to be reminded of my failure to protect him." He stood before her, utterly exposed. He had handed her the shards of his broken soul. He had shown her the ugly, secret wound he had hidden from the world his entire life. The great, powerful Duke of Blackwood was, in the end, just a boy who had failed to save his brother. Annalise looked from his tormented face to his shattered hand. Pity was a useless, insulting emotion. He did not need her pity. He needed to be seen. Truly seen. Not as a monster, not as a duke, not as a failure, but as a man. She did not reach for him. She did not offer empty words of comfort. Instead, a profound clarity, sharp and bright as a shard of glass, pierced through her. She knew what she had to do. Her art was not a hobby, not a secret shame. It was her voice. It was her strength. It was the truest part of her. With deliberate movements, she turned and walked to the corner of the studio, where she kept her locked leather portfolio. She placed it on a table and opened the clasp. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the drumming of the rain and Alistair's ragged breathing. She took out a small, oval piece of ivory. She walked back to him and held it out. It was a portrait of a young boy with Alistair's dark, serious eyes. But this boy was not somber. He was laughing, his head thrown back, a book open in his lap. It was Thomas, but not the stiff, formal boy from the gallery portrait. It was the Thomas from Alistair's stories, the gentle, joyful boy he had tried to protect. Annalise had painted him from the gallery portrait, but she had infused him with the life Alistair's grief had described. "I have been listening," she whispered. Alistair stared at the miniature, his face crumbling. A single, difficult tear traced a path down his cheek. He reached for it with his good hand, his fingers trembling as they brushed against the smooth ivory. Then, Annalise reached back into the portfolio and drew out another piece. It was her self-portrait, the one she had been working on when he arrived. It was not the plain, faded wallflower from the ball. It was a woman of quiet power, her gaze direct and clear, her lips curved in a faint, knowing smile. There were tiny flecks of blue paint on her cheek she had deliberately included. It was a portrait of an artist. "This is who I am, Alistair," she said, her voice steady and strong. "Not faded goods, not a quiet duchess, an artist." She held the portrait of his brother next to her own. "And this is who you have been trying to save. But he is gone, and I am here." She looked him directly in the eye, her own gaze unwavering. "We are not ghosts. We are not defined by the wounds our fathers gave us. We can be what we choose to be. But that life begins with truth, not transactions." She took a breath, summoning all her courage for the final, decisive act. "I will be your wife, Alistair, your true wife, in every sense of the word. We will share a life, not just a house. We will talk, we will argue, we will live." "Or," she said, her voice dropping, but losing none of its steel, "I will be nothing to you at all. I will take my paints, and I will leave. I will not live as a ghost in your house any longer. The choice is yours, but my terms are not negotiable." She stood before him, having laid her entire soul bare, just as he had. She had taken the power he had given her, the vulnerability, the confession, and used it not as a weapon against him, but as a foundation on which to build something new. She was not accepting his life, she was offering him a real one. He looked from the miniature of his laughing brother to the portrait of the strong, vibrant woman before him. He looked at her face, seeing her for the first time, not through the lens of his own pain, but in the clear, honest light of her own being. The carefully constructed walls of his fortress, the one he had been building since he was 12 years old, finally came crashing down. "Annalise," he said. It was the first time he had ever spoken her name without a title. The word itself was a surrender, a prayer. He reached for her, not with his perfect gloved hand, but with his scarred one. He laid its ruined landscape gently against her cheek. She did not flinch. She did not pull away. She leaned into his touch, covering his hand with her own, her fingers, stained with paint, lacing through his. And then he kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, not of demand. It was a kiss of profound, aching recognition. It was the meeting of two solitudes, the silent acknowledgement of two broken people choosing finally to be whole, together. A year later, the solarium was the brightest room in Blackwood Manor. The storm had passed long ago, leaving the world clean and new. Sunlight streamed through the sparkling glass, illuminating the vibrant, joyful clutter of Annalise's art. Her portraits were no longer hidden away. They were displayed in small, exquisite frames throughout the house, tiny windows into the souls of its inhabitants. Annalise sat at her easel, a soft smile on her face. She was finishing a new miniature. Alistair stood behind her, his chin resting on her hair. His left hand, ungloved and unashamed, rested on her shoulder. The house was no longer silent. It was filled with the low murmur of their constant conversation, with laughter, with life. She added the final, tiny stroke to the piece she was working on. It was a portrait of the two of them. In it, their hands were intertwined, one scarred and ruined, the other slender and stained with paint. It was a portrait of their truth. She had once thought her art was a means of escape, a way to hide from a world that saw her as worthless. But she had been wrong. It had never been a shield. It had been her voice, waiting patiently for the moment she was brave enough to use it. And now, at last, in the quiet strength of her husband's embrace, she was heard.